Go. Hi, everybody. My name is Christian. I use they, them pronouns. I use all kind pronouns, so feel free. He, him, they, them, she, her, anything works for me. And as I get started, I want to just offer up that even though that this is a virtual event, I am in Los Angeles, California right now, and that we're all in different virtual locations. I want to acknowledge my relationship to the land that I'm currently living, working, and teaching on. And I currently live as a settler on the unceded indigenous lands of the Chumash, the Tongva, and the Kiz nations. And these are the original and current stewards of the land. They are still present and existing on their own terms today. And I want to joyfully pay homage and reflect my own developing relationship to indigenous communities and history, and to my commitment to protecting this land and honoring the treaties made with its stewards. And I do that before teaching, in all of my teachings. One, to acknowledge my relationship to everything that I gain, everything that I learn, all the beautiful experiences that I have in the spaces that I am a part of, but also within the United States, to a continuing effort to making sure that we are constantly unsettling this notion of Indigenous history as being behind us, and really thinking of all of the ways in which we can include people in this space of joy. So thank you so much for being here. I also want to thank Venerable Tenpa. I have not been able to teach with Tenpa for a long, long time. And so it's like a homecoming to be able to be here right now. There's so many beautiful, familiar faces. So I'm very happy to see all of you. And I want to thank also Venerable Tenzin for helping us with tech support and for recording this right now. So as we move into our presentation for today, and we'll really get into the outline of it shortly. Tenpa will help us set up some expectations, what we're moving to, what we might start thinking about as we move through this presentation. I want to just settle us into this moment and see if we can collectively and individually just set our motivation for how we might move into this workshop. So to begin, and I'll just start from a basis of no matter where you are in your practice, just kind of offering some simple guidance as we fall into this practice. So to begin, just find a position where your body can feel relaxed and alert. And that might be sitting for you right now, might be kneeling, might be on a cushion or a bench, or even if it's comfortable for you, you can lie down if that feels best. And as you take this time to really arrive in this moment, feel free to close your eyes. Feel free to gently bring your gaze down so that it rests just a short distance in front of you. Whatever allows you to let your attention shift from everything going on around you, maybe everything that you've been doing today, if it's later in the day for you, or just the normal things that have happened so far in the morning, if it's still early like it is for me. And just allow yourself to settle down. And as you do so, maybe starting to notice the more subtle experiences of your body. You can let your breath be easy, letting go of any desire to breathe deeply or to control your breath in any way, and just letting it find its own natural rhythm. And with each cycle of breathing in and breathing out, you can let yourself feel more settled, more at ease, and more present. And if you can, give yourself permission to really set aside whatever might be pulling you away from your meditation right now. Whatever might feel like it's demanding your attention or pushing you away from this sense of presentness. And you can set aside any thoughts about what you wish you could have done already, or any concerns you have about what you need to do in the future. Planning is always one of those things that tends to pull us out of practice. I have a colleague who likes to say that each time these things come up, you can imagine it's like carrying a bag, and you can just set the bag back down again. No need to carry it right now. Just keep settling in more and more with each breath. And this is also a great time to set aside any expectations you might be carrying about this workshop, about the facilitators, about this content, or about what you hope to gain from this brief time that we have together. See if this gives you some more space to be present. See if it allows you to feel more open and accepting that whatever happens here, you'll find a way to engage with it and to transform it into something beneficial in your life. And now shift a bit to start considering what brought you here today. Of course, each one of us has our own unique reasons, and collectively, there's something about this work that brought us together. For some, it might be the practice of training your mind or learning more about how to work with your emotions. It might even be the comfort of just gathering in a group of people to listen and see what comes up for you. I know that even today, it's so important for us to be in community, to find spaces where we feel seen, where we feel heard, where we feel like we're in like-minded connection and community. So whatever it is, bring it to mind and see if you can feel joy for the ways that it helped to inspire this moment for you, for all the ways that it led to you being here right now. And then turning to our topic of the day, see if you can reflect on a recent moment when you felt joy. And as we go through today, you'll find that this doesn't have to be anything big. It could be something you offered yourself, like a good meal, or something you bought that makes you smile. Or maybe it's something that happened at work or with friends or family. It could even be just petting a cherished animal. Whatever it is, linger in it for a moment. And let yourself explore what made it feel so comforting, so fulfilling. What made it feel joyful for you? Now go even further and ask yourself, what might you do to offer yourself more moments like that? What might motivate you to bring joy into your life in ways that not only serve you, but let whatever you experience pour into others as well? What behaviors, what mindsets, practices, environments, and so forth might aid you in bringing more joy like this into your life? And as you breathe in, you can consider what you might need from yourself to achieve these things. And as you breathe out, set an intention for your time here. May I have the strength, the time, and the willingness to make space for joy in my life and to share it with those around me. And finally, as we settle into the day, let's set the motivation for our time together here, that whatever benefit we might gain, may it offer us what we need to move further down the path of attaining inner balance, and setting the attention and desire that whatever we might learn in this workshop, whatever we might learn from one another, or whatever we might gain in our own personal practice, may it strengthen our ability to learn, to transform, and to serve others in ways that bring more kindness, more compassion, and more joy. And in your own time, gently blink your eyes open, and you can conclude your practice.
Thank you, Christian. And my deepest gratitude to all of you for joining us in this beautiful preliminary meditation. I'm just going to talk briefly about the workshop structure for today. Essentially, this webinar is us going through different types of delight, different types of joy, different types of pleasure, different types of happiness, essentially, just nice, pleasant, joyful experiences that we might have. But of course, amongst all the possible forms of joy, and I don't think would be able to narrow them down to anything necessarily, were to just simply try to list all the possible joyful experiences. Amongst all of them, in this case, we will be focusing on the types of joy and delight that are strongly associated with our mental well-being, or can support our mental well-being, can nourish us, can carry us through different experiences associated with the outer world, can help us move through different inner experiences, even when those arise seemingly unprovoked. And of course, some of these types of joy would also be deeply associated with what we can consider to be the depths of contemplative practice, the liberating practices that are offered not just by Buddhism, but also by many other great contemplative traditions. And although we will be making references to the other traditions, our content for today would be primarily drawn from Buddhism and from different secular modalities that rely on Buddhist lineages, but present their material in a form that's available to hopefully most people on this planet. So that's the main source for today's content. And yet at the end, or after we're done and when we're sending out the recording, we will also include an abbreviated reading list, which will include some suggestions for further exploration, and which will also include links to some guided practices that might be helpful in our joint attempts to cultivate more joy in our life. So we will be going through different types of joy, essentially, and as we go through them, for each type, we will be mentioning associated practices that we can start integrating into our life if we are actively inspired to do so. And this doesn't mean that we need to start working with all these types of delights straight away. Even if in the aftermath of this session, you just feel inspired to start practicing this one thing or that one thing, and that already improves the quality of your life, the subjective quality of your life, that would already mean that our goal for this session has been accomplished. But eventually, since this recording is going to stay online, it's going to be available to registered participants. We're also going to include the slides and what we're sending out. Some other types of joy might start speaking to you and inspiring you to also explore those as well. And we will be starting with two types of joy or delight that might seem a little bit more on the hedonic side of things, more closely associated with our outer world and our interaction with the outer world. And then slowly, we will be moving towards the types of joy that are more inner in their nature and that come from within. But actually, it would be quite necessary to mention that all of these are important. All of these can be incredibly nourishing. And we're actually starting our exploration with the two types of joy that make us feel that we're deeply rooted in our interactions with the world, with our loved ones, with the world of nature and so forth, because it is on the basis of that that we can actually deeply explore our spiritual or contemplative aspirations. So we're going to be starting that with the idea of harvesting joy.
Thanks, Tenpa. I'm really excited to be able to present the hedonic pleasures because they're fun, right? These are the simple things that we sometimes take for granted. They're the things that we oftentimes get to indulge in. And I also just want to say, as a little bit of housekeeping for this, there's a lot that Tenpa and I have packed into this presentation, right? There's a whole lot that we'll be going through, and it's really a teaser. It's kind of a tasting menu of all of these different kinds of joy. Many things will likely arise for you as we're practicing or as we're talking to these. So feel free as we go to add in comments, add in questions, add in thoughts into the chat. And then we will have time, hopefully later on after this presentation, to really go back into those and start answering or addressing them. So as things come up, and there will be, there will be moments where we will also be asking you directly to share some of your thoughts. Feel free to go ahead and just use that chat as your way to communicate with us and as a way to communicate with everyone else. So when we start talking about harvesting joy, and this is one of the, for me, it's one of the most accessible ways that we can just readily start practicing joy. It's one of the things that we can find so many different new ways of playing with. It's for me the most playful, the most curious, the most exciting of what we can just immediately jump into. Harvesting joy really just means that we're attending to these pleasurable sensations in any of our 5 sense fields. So any of our 5 sensations with intent to harvest them for our contentment. So if we break that down a little bit, some of my background is as an English teacher. So I love breaking down words. I love really thinking, where does this come from? Why are we using it? What does this really mean for us? So when we say harvesting, we're really talking about gathering something up, right? We're talking about taking things, thinking of like gathering a crop or a harvest. We're thinking of obtaining a resource that we can use in the future. We can use right now, but we can also use it in the future. And when we're talking about joy, we're really just talking about a feeling of pleasure and happiness that we have. So the idea of harvesting joy is obtaining these feelings of pleasure and really reveling in them, really allowing ourselves to take advantage of them as resources that are renewable, they are continuous, and they are accessible in so many different ways. So what are we actually harvesting here, right? When we're talking about harvesting joy, we're talking about harvesting our enjoyable emotions. We're talking about our enjoyable feelings. And this might seem frivolous. It might seem like such a small thing. Like, why would we even do this? What is it even going to allow us in our lives? But enjoyable emotions are the things that motivate us to continue doing everything in our life, right? Enjoyable emotions, happiness, pleasure, these are the things that actually propel us through our lives in pursuit of everything from meaning to self-actualization, to a sense of wholeness, to love. And this is not something that is just simply at the surface. This is really something that, you know, evolutionarily, when we think of how we have developed, right, as humans, we have developed in a sense of moving towards pleasure, right? It's something that allows us to participate in activities for ourselves, for others. It allows us to connect. And it also is something that propels us towards this very natural, innate sense of survival. So we find pleasure in things like eating. We find pleasure in things like sleep. We find pleasure in things like laughing or being in connection with loved ones, collaborating, play. These are all things that allow us to feel connected, to feel loved, to feel seen, to really feel like we are part of something. It also allows us to feel settled in ourselves, right? When things feel good, we feel good. We're encouraged to continue finding more ways to experience that thing. So we can build a habit with this notion of harvesting joy and this notion of finding pleasure and connecting to it on a continuous basis. So when we also talk about harvesting, why would we harvest these? Why wouldn't we just, see them, recognize them, say hello, kind of walk away? When we're talking about harvesting, we're talking about an intentional practice, right? When we think about harvesting crops, we might think about all of the time and effort that goes into farming, right? All the time and effort that goes into sowing seeds, tilling the soil, planting, watering, tending to, and then finally, when crops actually grow, harvesting those crops, figuring out what we need and what we don't need, selling, giving away, making into things, right? It's a whole cycle. And so we talk about harvesting because we understand that positive emotions, these things that are pleasurable, that propel us, are fleeting. These are things that are that come up in life, they pass away like everything else, they change and they are impermanent. And so we harvest them because in the contemplative traditions that we're pulling from, there's such a demonstration that as we continually access these things, as we find more and more ways to access them over and over again in a continuous way, there's positive emotions that come from this, there's pro-social behavior, and it builds a habit up of allowing us to find these spaces of pleasure in just about anything that we're doing. So just to give you a little bit of background into where we're coming from, before we go into a practice of harvesting joy, harvesting joy is really an extension of mindfulness of feeling. And that is one of the 4 applications of mindfulness. And so the 4 applications of mindfulness really are quintessential Buddhist practices of both concentration and insight. And they're based on some of the earliest teachings of the Buddha. And these days they're kind of pervasive in secular trainings, in direct Buddhist trainings, in all of these different modalities, including a modality that both Tenpa and I have learned, which is the Cultivating Emotional Balance curriculum. And to give you a sense of the 4 applications of mindfulness, they move through 4 different domains of our experiences. So these domains are the body, in which we're exploring sensations in and on the body. There's the mindfulness of feelings, where we will kind of drop down into our harvesting joy. And this is where we attend to feelings that are pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral in the traditional sense. And we'll sort of go off into a derivative of that in a different way. There's mindfulness of the mind, what's coming up in the mind, and then also mindfulness of phenomena. So I want to just make this a little bit more personal, make it a little bit more unique, so it's not so abstract. When we talk about harvesting joy, what does that actually look like? How do we actually go about doing that? So I find it's always beneficial to know a bit where, to add a bit more about where I'm coming from in this, because joy for me is it's a crucial practice. It's kind of what allows me to do all the things that I'm doing. It allows me to, in a world where there's so much going on, find moments where I can slow down, where I can pause, where I can really connect with parts of the world around me and parts of myself. So I often say that it's not hard for me to find joy in the small things. It's harder for me to find joy in the bigger things. But I also recognize that I have created spaces for myself to cultivate this joy. So when I'm harvesting joy, it's usually in moments that are, I love eating. So finding a nice cup of tea is something that I can really allow myself to harvest joy in. Being able to just be connected to things that make me smile. That might be beautiful landscapes, living in Los Angeles, that is being outside, it's being in the mountains, it's being at the beach, it's taking long walks. It's understanding that I have access to this beauty and I can just kind of revel in it. And so I want to play around with this a little bit more in a practice. But I also want to invite Tenpa to maybe add in a little bit of where you find yourself harvesting joy before we get into that.
Thanks, Christian. I think one of the things I'm noticing right now in my life is a realization I've had a few months ago of how important it is for me to have at least 1 hour throughout the day where I just chill. And that usually means sitting somewhere where there's a little bit of greenery around, whether potted or actual trees. So being in a nice natural environment, having a nice cup of tea or having a nice healthy meal, and then spending a little bit of time reading. And those are the primary things that I would attend in those moments to harvest joy, the pleasure that arises from those very simple things that also have to do with just maintaining my physical health and so forth, but that together combine into this very refreshing, very nourishing experience that also brings me down to the understanding, helps me come back to the understanding that, yeah, there are some nice things in this life, despite all the difficulties that the world is going through. There are these moments where there's a little bit of sunlight coming through the leaves and a nice cup of green tea in front of you and a nice dessert and just a nice book with you to enjoy. So that's my primary practice of harvesting joy at the moment.
Thank you, Tenpa. So because harvesting joy is something that we can access from any of our 5 sensations, it's something that we oftentimes can do anywhere we are, at any moment where it feels accessible to us. So what I'm going to do is lead us in a practice where we explore harvesting joy through each one of these sensations, just to give you a sense of what that might feel like for you. We'll take maybe about 10 or so minutes on this practice. So we will be moving through it in a way to just give you that taste and move on. This is something that you can really take your time in your own way, something that you can really focus on any one sensation, or you can blend them all together. But as we start moving into this practice, again, just find a stable position for yourself where your body can be still, anywhere that's comfortable for you. And again, something where you feel relaxed and at ease. As we start a practice around finding pleasure, it is absolutely wonderful to extend that to your body first. And of course, if at any time you need to move or readjust, feel free to do so. Don't feel locked into any specific position. And if it feels comfortable, you can close your eyes, or you can keep them open just slightly. And as you continue to settle, let your breath find its own natural rhythm. With each breath out, letting your body relax into a sense of ease. And if you find any tension lingering anywhere in your body, see if you can soften it. Just bring some awareness to it. And maybe release it all together. This is also a perfect moment to remember your motivation for being here, or even to imagine what positive benefits or influence you hope to inspire in yourself or in others. And settling more and more with this natural, relaxed state as your foundation. Begin to open your awareness to what's currently available to you within the space of your 5 senses. So as I said, in this practice, we go beyond simply being with what we're perceiving through our 5 senses. And instead, we go further to deliberately select whatever appears in the mind that brings about pleasant feelings. This pleasant feeling doesn't have to be large, doesn't even have to be obvious. It can be the smallest or most subtle of things. And often you might hear someone say, attend to, or bring your full attention to. I like to say things like linger here, like dawdle, bathe in this, soak it up. And the whole time you're doing this, you're staying curious. Sometimes there are experiences that might at first appear the opposite of pleasant or joyful. With a little time and attention, we might find something there, something subtle. Maybe the sunlight is too bright for us, but we find that it lights up a part of the room that makes us smile. Or maybe the wind outside is too loud, but we can find pleasure in the way that clouds move quickly across the sky. So really give yourself the space here to explore and let yourself indulge. Let this feel really playful for you. So that you can experience cultivating joy through each one of these senses, or what are called our sense doors. We'll briefly go through them one by one. And so to start with our visual perception, if your eyes are closed right now, feel free to open them just slightly. Whatever is comfortable for you. And of course, you can keep them closed if that's most comfortable as well. It's really up to you. So within the field of your vision right now, what can you easily find that brings you joy? Without building an elaborate story about it, or really analyzing it or overthinking, what sort of joy can you access? If you can find something that brings you joy, place your attention on it and attend to it fully. And really gather up the joy it brings to you right now. And just take a few moments here to do this. And now feel free to let this image go as you gently close your eyes again, or let your lids lower a bit. And shift your attention to the domain of sound. Now, when we think about sound, this also includes silence. So really explore what feels right to you. And if it's accessible to you, what can you perceive through your perception of sound that really feels good or brings you joy? Harvest this for yourself. Really soak it up. Now shift your attention to your ability to smell, or your olfactory sense door. And so if this is available to you, see if you can find a pleasant scent that draws you in. Again, don't worry about taking too long here. Once you find something pleasant and interesting, bring your attention there and just gather up as much joy as you need. Now, once again, let your attention shift away and towards your sense of taste. It may be that you still have the flavor of food in your mouth from a recent meal. Or if it's earlier in the morning, maybe you have the freshness of having brushed your teeth before we began. Whatever pleasure you can derive from your taste, stay curious here. And just explore whatever might come up for you, whatever is available. And finally, let your attention shift toward what tactile sensations feel good to your body right now. You might find that joy arises from the feeling of your body in contact with the seat or cushion beneath you, or from the fabric of your clothes on your skin. Or it might even be a sensation inside your body. You might have a pleasant warmth or a cool sensation, or something else that just gives you a sense of feeling good. Whatever it is, linger here in this sensation. Bring your attention to it and really allow yourself to soak it up. Harvest as much joy as you can from this experience. And now I invite you to open your awareness to all of your available senses. And let your attention move across whatever sensory experiences bring you joy. I like to think of this like a bee moving from flower to flower, just letting your attention glide between these pleasant feelings. And stay with each one for as long as you need, harvesting joy and just cultivating a sense of appreciation as you go. And as you bring your practice to a close, let any thoughts or images fade back into the space of your mind, and just stay with the spaciousness of your own open awareness for a few more moments. And then mentally dedicate any benefit that may have come from your practice to the same intention you set earlier, in the hopes that whatever happiness or freedom you gain through your practice, that might inspire others to move along their own path toward greater awakening. And then feel free to conclude your practice. So as that's still showing up for you, or as you're exploring what that was like, feel free to drop in the chat what came up. Feel free to write how that felt, any bits of joy you were able to harvest for yourself, maybe sensations that worked really well, sensations that maybe are a little sticky or maybe need some more time for you. Feel free to share whatever is present for you right now. So moving on to another form of joy, express delight at the company of others. So when we're really playing around with this kind of joy, ooh, I'm saying lovely sound of the rain outside. I love that. When we're talking about expressing delight at the company of others, this is another fun one. This is our ability to really be with other people. And I would say this is also extending it to just being with other beings. And being able to have joy arise from these meaningful connections, this meaningful companionship that we have with others, and then doing our best to express that, to maintain a meaningful connection. So it's not simply the feeling, but it's our ability to feel this joy and then be able to share that joy with another person. For me, this comes up again, and we brought this up a little bit earlier, but it comes up when we are in spaces that for us are a community where we feel belonging. We feel like this is a space that shares in our beliefs, it shares in our actions, it shares in our sense of maybe what we want to see in the world. And then and this can be a person, this can be a larger community, and finding ways to show up for that, right? I can think of some of the communities where I feel really connected are, I've been a video game designer for a long time and just a designer of play and interactive spaces. And so for me, when I'm around designers, when I'm around geeks and nerds and people that I think can start looking at the world in ways where we can constantly find play, I feel at home. I feel like I can be more vulnerable. I can try things out. I can see failure as an opportunity to learn, right? I can let go of these expectations that everything has an end goal or everything needs to resolve in a certain way. And I can just allow myself to be at ease, to be comfortable, and to show up more fully, right? I feel like I am a part of those spaces, and being in those spaces makes me feel fuller. And I can also share with people, because I can be more open, because I can be more vulnerable, I feel more capable of showing them and telling them how great it is to be in those spaces, right? I feel great about reinforcing my ability to show up there. This is also something that I have when I am in the presence of my closest friends, that, and I'm sure many of you experience this or know what I'm talking about, but those friends where you can be doing absolutely nothing, you can be staring at the wall and watching paint dry, but it still feels okay. It's still perfectly fine, right? You don't have to think about it. You don't have to force conversation. You don't have to really worry about it. And then being able to just turn to them and say, I'm so glad that I get to do this with you. I wouldn't be able to do this with somebody else. They would think I was weird. They would think I was boring. They would think whatever else. But being able to feel that delight and then share it with other people so that it reinforces those connections. This is where we start seeing the ways in which joy becomes what we tend to call pro-social behavior, right? These ways of offering up opportunities to create stronger bonds with others, stronger bonds with community, and our ability to show up with more equanimity, with more compassion, with more kindness. You'll also see here this associated practice of actively attending to the delight of communication and express it for others to know their presence matters to you. There are some very simple ways of doing this, of expressing this delight in our active verbal communication with one another as well. Nonviolent communication is something that comes to mind a lot for me. Being able to speak to people with compassion, speak to people with honesty, speak to people with a sense of clarity that conveys respect and really reminds them of their own inherent dignity. And then another thing that I think of that has come up in a lot of different pro-social communication spaces, workshops, classes, just communities that I'm a part of, which is mirroring back what other people are saying so that they feel connected to, right? We understand that mirroring body language is a way in which people actually feel like they are in deeper community with another person, or they feel like they're actually being heard. And we can do that very intentionally in our speech, where when someone is saying something, we can mirror back what they're saying to them so that we make sure that we've heard it correctly. And we also make sure that they feel like we are invested and connected with them. So I want to extend this to Tenpa as well and ask, what are the expressed delight that you find in the company of others, or what comes up for you when you think of this?
Well, two examples come to mind when I think of this practice, and I've been trying to cultivate it consciously as well. One very simple thing is that I like evening walks with friends. And when I am taking a nice evening walk with a friend or with a group of friends, I like to say very simply things like, "Oh, how wonderful to be here with you." Although it's a simple phrase and it's a very simple thing to say, well, it might take time to actually find the courage to say that, but it's a relatively simple idea. Even though it's quite simple, I think it might have a meaningful effect on people around me. And it certainly has an effect on me, on how I feel and on how connected I actually feel to the people that I'm with, sharing both harvesting joy from, for example, the nice evening walk and this expressed delight at being in the company of others. So both types of joy, hedonic joy, actually come to play here. And another very simple example also from my life is that I am always very joyful when people do show up for my classes. It might sound vain or ridiculous or a bit superficial, and maybe some people do find joy in just speaking at an empty wall or preparing for a course, and then even if just one person shows up, still teaching that 42-hour course. And yet I find it very joyful when more people show up. And it's not just the numbers, it's actually seeing those people, seeing their names at least, seeing them on Zoom and seeing their comments in the chat and seeing their responses, and really knowing that there's a whole mechanism of interdependence at play there, and we're all actively engaging with the material, and it might bring some benefit. So how wonderful to be here with all of you right now as well. And this is where actually we would invite you to share similar phrases that you might be saying in your life to your loved ones, your partners, your friends, your spiritual communities, your work communities, and so forth, of similar nature, expressing that delight and establishing that pro-social feeling, that feeling of connectedness and trust. So if anything comes to mind from your own experience or your own practice of this, please share it in the chat as we go along.
There's there's a couple things that Tenpa brought up that I think are so so beautiful and simple. But one is the courage to actually say this to people, right? I think sometimes we can really appreciate people in our lives, but we don't always tell people how much we appreciate them. Or we show up in places again and again, but we don't always say to the people who are holding those spaces or cultivating those spaces something as simple as thank you, right? Thank you for creating a space in which I can be here. Thank you for allowing for this space to exist so that I can find and fall into a space of belonging. And so this courage, this idea of having this strength and this fortitude to actually be vulnerable enough to include people in this space of joy is such a critical component of this expressed delight. And then this other very simple aspect of it of just saying thank you, just allowing yourself to say thank you for being with me. Thank you for showing up. And so we'll move on to another form of delight.
Right. And this one might already be on the eudaimonic side of things, even though, of course, it has a lot to do with how we interact with the world and how we respond to the people around us, how we deal with hedonic goods that we might need in this life, or that we might just want, even if when we don't need them. And this is, to quote the Buddha, the joy of blamelessness. That's one of the phrases that the historical Buddha, or Buddha Shakyamuni, as we sometimes say in the Tibetan cultural tradition. This is one type of joy that the Buddha has described as one of the types of delight, one of the types of happiness, one of the types of well-being that are especially meaningful when we are leading a lay life, but also, of course, absolutely and incredibly meaningful for monastics as well, and in general, meaningful for anyone, because we are all existing in this network of interdependence, and we're all trying to figure out what it means to be ethical people who are not too harmful and hopefully somewhat helpful. And that's, I would say, the essence of the practice of ethics. Before going into this, I would like to say that this is where the ensuing types of joy, this one, then the one, and then the three next ones, would correspond quite closely to a presentation of practices or a system of methods that the Buddha described as three trainings, sometimes practiced in the form of so-called three higher trainings, when they're especially directed at profound spiritual liberation. But for simplicity, the well-known Tibetologist, Dr. Robert Thurman, calls those three types of education. Essentially, we're talking about three quintessential ways of educating our body, speech, and mind, or our mind and heart, and also somewhat our speech and body, and so forth. We're essentially talking about educating ourselves in the issues associated with happiness. We're educating ourselves so that we can be happy and so that we can bring greater happiness to others. So this first one is the training in ethics, or the education in all matters that pertain to ethics. And to describe this one, I wanted to quote Sylvia Burstein, who is a senior teacher in the insight meditation tradition, senior teacher in the Spirit Rock practice community in the United States, and one of my favorite authors who always manages to soothe my nervous system when I'm feeling somewhat activated or agitated by what's going on in my life or in the world, and so forth. So from her book on 10 ethical perfections of a bodhisattva, because she's writing from the point of view of the Pali textual tradition in Buddhism. So the being aspiring for full awakening in Pali is called the bodhisattva, and the perfections this being is practicing would be called parami. So in her book on that, called Pay Attention for Goodness Sake, Sylvia dedicates the second chapter to the practice of ethics, or in this case, morality. That's the translation she uses. And I'm going to quote it as that, even though, of course, some people are not too comfortable with the word morality. It sounds too, and I apologize for the pun, it sounds a bit moralistic, but actually what it's pertaining to is just that training in ethics. It's just that training in non-harmful and hopefully also helpful behavior. Just making wise decisions about what we do, how we do it, why we do it, and so forth. Or, as some of my teachers also describe it, and once again, I apologize for the colloquial expression, it's simply about not being a jerk. How do we avoid being a jerk? How do we try to be good people? Or how do we manifest the energies of our body, speech, and mind in a way that, according to the conventions of the world, the perception and the experience of others, would allow them to see us, to perceive us as good people? So what's the deal with that? So this is what Sylvia writes here, and I'm going to read it out. If I intend to practice my morality, I'll need to be sure I stay calm enough to ensure that I don't do anything heedlessly. My commitment to the Buddha's specific guidelines for wise action, wise livelihood, and wise speech, the parts of the Eightfold Path, which is the fourth noble truth, most directly governing my behavior in the world, that commitment acts as a fail-safe mechanism to keep my mind, inflamed by passion, from saying go for it just this one time. That commitment stays strong if I acknowledge the pain I feel when I cause suffering. how glad I am to repair injuries, how pleasant it is to feel that there is no one toward whom and nothing about which I feel guilty. The Buddha called that good feeling the bliss of blamelessness. And of course, this immediately would remind us that most likely the ultimate bliss of blamelessness, the full feeling that we're completely content with regards to our ethical practice, that we're completely settled in what we do with our body, speech, and mind, that we never have any regrettable ethical episodes, then we never say the wrong thing, we never do the wrong thing, we never are led on by our passions and so forth. That ultimate level of blamelessness would probably only be available to beings who are incredibly high on their contemplative or spiritual path, or perhaps to also people who are ultimately narcissistic and psychopathic and never challenge anything they do and never even consider that something might be wrong with their actions. So we might have these two extremes, the ultimate spiritual perfection and the ultimate insensitivity to any matters ethical. But most of us would find ourselves somewhere in the middle of that spectrum where we do have regrettable actions, and yet we're trying to show up for others, but also show up for our own ideas of what ethical might mean. And the essence of what Sylvia is talking about here, at least in my understanding, in my reading of her wonderful words, is that, of course, we need to attend to what we are doing and thus not to do anything heedlessly. That's reflected in the name of the book, Pay Attention for Goodness Sake. And of course, we are familiar with the concept of attention, attentional training, attention muscles, and the associated qualities or mental functions of mindfulness, introspection, and so forth. Essentially, so many mechanisms in our mind that have to do with attention, with attending, with tending to something, and so forth. So we have all this incredible inner machinery. We have all these beautiful mechanisms, and we can strengthen them, we can train in them, we can overcome the negative effects of attentional imbalances and so forth. But what for? What's the purpose of that? Well, to acquire this type of joy, we're simply attending to what we're about to do, or to what we are considering doing, or in some cases to what we have done, and asking ourselves, is this really a good idea? Would it really be a good idea to commit this action? Whether that's writing a thoughtless comment somewhere on social media and harming or hurting someone, or multiple people actually, whether that's uttering something that gets recorded or recalled by other people many decades later, as they still experience the crippling shame associated with their body image, because what we did was essentially body shaming of a particular kind. Whether it's meaningful to lie or to steal, or to cheat, or of course to harm the bodies of others, whether any of it is worth it, worth both the inner unpleasant experiences that we're going to have and the devastating effect that a seemingly small action might have on the overall interdependence of things. In both my work, my humble chaplaincy work, I don't work as a professional chaplain in hospitals and so forth, but of course, as a monastic, sometimes people talk to me about their problems and try to share and just want me to show up and listen, not so much offer advice, let alone counseling, but just in showing up and listening. And also from my own life experience, I've seen so many times the utterly devastating effect that even one lie can have on a many-year relationship, or even one harmful comment, one thoughtless comment, one comment that is biased or unbalanced. The effect that that might have on a person's reputation or relationships with others and so forth. And I'm not going to go too deep into multiple examples that we might all think of, but the devastating effect of even one heedless action might be very large. And then, of course, we know that sometimes things still slip through. They still go through our filters, even though a large part of acquiring this type of joy is working on those filters. Some of this joy just comes through knowing, hey, I am actually dedicated to this. I'm dedicated to this work. It's not for me something that is meaningless. It's not something superficial. It's not just for people who are goody-goodies. It's not just for Buddhists. It's not just for Christians. It's not just for those others who might want to work on their behavior because they are the jerks of this world. It's for all of us to keep showing up for what we believe is right. And some of these things are very basic. We might believe it's right to not lie. It's right to not harm the bodies of others. It's right to not make others feel horrible just because we are in a bad mood. And then the trauma of our observations or our comments might stay with them for decades. It's not very cool to do that. Maybe those are some of our core beliefs that we for ourselves might write down at some point and think, hey, even outside of Buddhist ethics, secular ethics, Christian ethics, and so forth, these are just basic facts of life that I believe in. It's nice to be an honest person, or it's nice to try to not steal. It's nice to be fair in dealing with others and so forth. And showing up for that, working on that, knowing that it's going to take decades to perfect that practice, which is why Sylvius here says, if I intend to practice my morality, practicing, perfecting, cultivating, it's strengthening those ethical muscles, essentially, and knowing that each day that we spend doing that brings a level of joy. But then sometimes, of course, we fail, inevitably, and then we acknowledge that we've caused some pain, and hopefully, instead of repeating the same things again and again and again, year after year, and just deepening the pain that we're causing our loved ones or the world or the environment or the economy of the country that we've pledged to serve and so forth, instead of repeatedly bringing harm, we can attend to what we're about to do and pull ourselves back, but also we can make amends. We can repair injuries, and we can also change our inner landscape so that in the future we won't have to feel so guilty. So this is what the Buddha called the good feeling of the bliss of blamelessness. Absolutely equally probably relevant for all of us, because then, as it says in the Buddhist tradition, one wonderful thing that comes with that is that when we approach the end of our life, even if we have not cultivated contemplative practices such as meditations on loving kindness and compassion and so forth, which can have a very powerful effect on making our death incredibly peaceful and actually inspiring for others. Even if we have not cultivated the profound practices of insight, which also would have a very transformative effect on the way we die, even if we haven't done any of that, according to some the core Buddhist texts in the Tibetan tradition, coming to the end of our life and knowing, I really did my best to try and be a good person. I really tried to practice these basic ideas, not lying, not cheating, not stealing, and so forth. The joy that would fill our heart when we would think back to that would actually, once again, make the process of passing away quite peaceful for us and peaceful and inspiring for others. Because the last thing we might want to have and to experience in our life is feeling constantly and incredibly guilty throughout our life, but also at the time of our death. And that's one reason for why the Buddhist tradition emphasizes this training, whether in secular context or in the Buddhist context, whether we consider the idea of karma or we don't, doesn't really matter. We all know that there's interdependence, that our actions have consequences, and trying to work with those consequences is the invitation here. Knowing that we care about that we do our best, and then the next day we do even better, and then the next day we do even better. And yes, there are regrettable steps, but then we try to make amends and we continue working on this. All of that brings this joy of blamelessness. And this is where we would like to take a 5-minute bio break so that we might take good care of our bodies and then return to talk about the associated practices with this type of joy. But as we do that, we would invite you to do a very simple and perhaps a bit silly exercise. And that is, we're inviting you to share the color that for you is most closely associated with the idea or the experience of joy. Might seem a bit frivolous, might seem a bit silly or superficial, but actually, in my experience, if we do identify a color like that and then we bring it into our life more fully, it actually might change our mood quite strongly, let alone give us some ideas for decorating our new place. So please think of that, share that in the chat. And in just 5 minutes, we're going to be back to talk more about the practices that we might do to cultivate the joy of blamelessness. So see you all in 5 minutes. Thank you so much for being with us here today. There are many wonderful replies here in the chat. So just to preserve this beauty, I'm going to read them out briefly, and then we'll go into the practices associated with joy of blamelessness. So some of the replies here: deep, vibrant greens found in redwood trees. I think for me, the color that brings me joy is bright yellow, like sunshine. Yellow for me as well. Deep, rich terracotta and midnight blue indigo. The color of a California poppy, bright orange. Golden light color, the slightly orangish yellow of a daffodil. Yellow, deep orange. Deep aquamarine brings me an immediate sense of joy. I find shades of blues and green most joyful. Yellow for me too, bright yellow like flowers. So, and this is in no way a competition, I think Team Yellow wins, but only in this specific group, right? Because we might have so many other responses from people across the world, and this would be somewhat culturally specific, but also beyond that, we are so unique, each one of us. So literally any color might be bringing you joy. And what's important here is to attend to that and to use that skillfully, knowing our predispositions to try and cultivate some joy around that as well. So some more replies here as well. Bright yellow like flowers. Yellow is the color of Jupiter, the planet associated with joy. Deep blue of the ocean can rival green. A bright, vibrant green that kind of glows as if alive. Beautiful. And it's such a joy to be even reading that out and imagining all these colors and where we might find them, and just sitting down and harvesting the joy that these colors might bring about. Wow, what a gift. So to cultivate the joy of blamelessness, we might be using a very wide variety of different practices, actually. There's a wide variety of ethical methods or methods for fine-tuning our ethics. Not fine-tuning our ethics simply so that we harm the world less and we bring more benefit to the world, which of course should probably be the forefront of our mind, but also fine-tuning our ethics so that we ourselves might experience the joy and the ease associated with that. Sometimes that actually happens naturally. For example, people who have been deeply hurt by a particular type of behavior, for example, on behalf of their loved one, then know what it feels like to be on the receiving end of that specific type of treatment or behavior. And if they are aware to a large degree of the ethical repercussions of this type of behavior and the effect it had on them, if they their mind and the state of their mind allows them to generate the resolve to at least, I would never act that way. I'll make it my mission in this life to never do anything similar. That type of suffering actually can be a powerful source of behavior that then brings this type of joy. But of course, ideally, we would all want to fine-tune our ethics before we enter the school of hard knocks, and before we are educated by our suffering, just because as humans, we're absolutely capable of imagining what it might feel like to be on the receiving end of this. We are capable of empathizing. And we also have a very rich tapestry of cultural products that explain to us how most atrocious types of suffering or most atrocious types of treatment feel for people who are experiencing them. So with all of that, we then might work with these methods. The first one is a very popular one, as in that's the practice that His Holiness the Dalai Lama teaches most often, whether to Buddhists or to mixed audience, when he talks about such things as world peace or secular ethics or preservation of the planet or interfaith dialogue and so forth. That's the number one practice that he talks about. Not so much mindfulness of breathing or meditating on the nature of the mind or reciting the mantra of Om Mani Padme Hum. Yes, all those methods are absolutely beneficial, but one could argue if we recite a lot of mantras, but we don't practice this very first thing, there might be some spiritual bypass happening. And the essence of this method, very simply, is to take some time each day to recommit ourselves to the practice of nonviolence. And as many people would know, in his books about secular ethics, and one of those books will be on this suggested reading list after this class. It's a wonderful book called Beyond Religion, which is about secular ethics. The Dalai Lama often emphasizes 3 levels of nonviolence. We try to generate the resolve to not harm, to avoid harming as much as we can. We try to generate the resolve to actually benefit others, help them, support them. And then we also generate the resolve to cultivate the resources of our mind and heart. And within the Buddhist tradition, from which this 3-fold list comes, this 3rd point would be cultivating the altruistic, enlightened attitude, or awakening attitude of bodhicitta. But when His Holiness describes this in the secular context, he talks about cultivating the resources of our mind and heart, which means learning about all these types of joy and learning about attentional training, emotional training, how to cultivate all these types of inner balance, and how to then use all of this to be of service to the world and to at least not harm the world, and not harm our loved ones and others, and not harm animals, of course, and birds, and pretty much anyone. Not disturb the interdependence of things, but to enhance everything that is good in the tapestry of life. So that's practice number 1. And His Holiness recommends, and many of his students and co-authors and editors include that in their own books as well. One recommendation is to wake up in the morning and to start our day by thinking about this. May I avoid harming? May I bring benefit? May I cultivate the resources of my mind and heart? And then at the end of the day, perhaps checking if we have been able to do that. That in itself already brings some joy of blamelessness. Why? Because we have been actively committed to this. And what a wonderful thing to do, what a wonderful thing to know. I'm living my life meaningfully. I'm at least trying to accomplish this. And so many people on this planet never even think about these things for multiple reasons, including not having the privilege simply to, or the time to simply sit down and think about all these fancy things. But if we do have that bubble of leisure where for 5 minutes in the morning we can contemplate that, we have an opportunity to add that sense of meaning to what we're doing in this world. Then the next point here is simply an extension of that, quite popular and quite important in the Buddhist tradition. But these days, due to the incredible work of a Vietnamese master by the name of Thich Nhat Hanh, also very widely used in secular mindfulness communities. And that's the practice of 5 mindfulness trainings, as Thich Nhat Hanh's community calls them, or 5 precepts, as they're known in the Buddhist tradition. And those are associated with avoiding killing and harming the bodies of others, avoiding stealing, taking what was not freely given, avoiding lying, avoiding misusing our sexual energy in harmful ways, which of course also implies not using our ability to charm others in harmful ways, not misleading others, and so forth, and also protecting the sexual health of others when we know there is, for example, some danger of passing on an infection and so forth, all of those considerations. And then finally, being careful, mindful, and cautious with intoxicants, which historically primarily pertained to drugs and alcohol, but of course can also include intoxicating types of entertainment, or really anything that can intoxicate our mind. But once again here, the idea with these precepts or mindfulness trainings is not that we one time receive them from an ordained lineage master, and then we're happy knowing that we have our little card saying that we are now a practicing holder of these precepts. In many practice communities, sessions or days of practice begin with actively chanting these. And some communities would even do the practice where the chant leader would read one of these precepts, and then the entire practice mandala, the entire practice group would slow down, and they would actively contemplate that and ask themselves, hey, how am I doing with this? Am I really good with not lying? Am I really good with not killing? Then they would move on to the next one, take some time to contemplate the next one, and so forth. And it's very powerful when done in a group, but also very powerful when down on our own. So that could be another idea. And of course, there are wonderful books on 5 mindfulness trainings, and we'll include a wonderful book from Thich Nhat Hanh specifically that explores this approach to cultivating joy of blamelessness. Then a wonderful advice from Sylvia Boorstein herself, attending to our actions 3 times. Before we do something, if our mindfulness allows us to catch ourselves there, then as we're doing the action, and then in the aftermath of the action. So before, maybe we think, well, is it such a good idea to really go to that meeting? And if by paying attention, we see, well, no, it's actually not worth it. Why would I go through all of that again? Or why would I spend my time that way? And we can stop ourselves right there. And of course, this is where we need some inner resources to pull ourselves back from our passions, to use Sylvia's word again, but also to pull ourselves back from peer pressure or pressure from the person we've arranged the meeting with and so forth. We do need to have a little bit of resilience around that, the inner strength. Or during, sometimes we are in the middle of saying something that's not true. And this is where there's actually a lot of benefit in catching ourselves, just saying, oh, wait, sorry, no, scratch that. Actually not telling the truth. And I don't know why, but let me tell you the truth. Or just stopping in the middle of whatever it is that we're doing and immediately redirecting the energy of our body at speech, and of course, the energy of our mind. So what a wonderful thing to do, to check our actions as we're doing them, which also pertains to projects. Is this a meaningful project? Is this a meaningful job? Is this a meaningful trip to take? Some friends I have stopped their travel plans during the pandemic when they realized shortly before departing, shortly before leaving, that due to the conditions constantly changing, the trip that initially seemed safer is now not such a good idea. And yes, of course, there's always something to adjust, and there's financial loss perhaps associated with that. But by thinking about these things clearly, we can see whether it's worth it or not. And then after, was it worth it? Was it worth it? What I'm feeling is it good? What I'm feeling in the aftermath of this action is how I made others feel. Was it worth it? So asking these questions, and then it brings us to the last point. When we see that something was regrettable, we of course might want to try to make amends, first of all, to heal the relationship. So if outer amends are available to us, apologizing, doing the remedial work, taking the accountability, and of course we need to apologize skillfully as well, and so forth. Wonderful. Sometimes that would not be available to us. So this is where Sylvia talks about making inner amends, and that includes doing our inner transformational work, but also sending loving kindness to other people and praying for other people, or generating the inner resolve to never do the same action again, and actually trying to really stick with that decision, trying to help that decision go really deeply into the depths of our mind, so that the next time similar passions arise for us, we know not to do that again. And of course, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and in general, in the Sanskrit tradition of Buddhism, Sanskrit textual tradition, that includes also all the beautiful lineages of Buddhism in East Asia, there are so-called purification practices, which sometimes include mantras and visualizations or reciting different things, but the essence of those is very good, solid psychology, where we generate a specific sequence of mental states that would help us change our behavior. And in the aftermath of having done these practices, once again, we're invited to then feel the joy of blamelessness. Not because it means we're no longer responsible by what we did, but because we do need to feel that we've at least done some healing work, and we need to feel good about that healing work as we continue to do more and more and more of remedial action. So this is a very powerful one, and my one recommendation would be to explore some of the sources we include as suggested reading list, and especially to actually explore chapter 2 in Sylvia's own book, because it's a very, very clear and elegant guide to this topic, this type of joy. And I think if we all worked with it quite intently, the world might be a much better place, and there would be less suffering in interpersonal relationships, in our relationship with the environment, and so forth. But then, once we have cultivated a certain degree of joy of blamelessness, and that might just mean that we have started to generate this resolve to practice nonviolence, to not be harmful, and so forth. We would embark on the second path, or we would start practicing the second type of education, inner education associated with happiness. And that's our education in mental stability, or concentration, or samadhi. And of course, since many people present are students of Dr. Alan Wallace and have met him on many occasions and have read his books, they know he has a brilliant way of explaining this topic and talking about how samadhi is much more than simply concentration. It's actually a gathering and a balancing of our mental energy. So it's not just about being able to stay with the object of our concentration, which is a large part of it, but it's also about refining our mental energies in a way that is so deeply and so profoundly therapeutic. And because we're refining our mental energies, the psychosomatic stuff that happens on our body also gets largely resolved and rebalanced and transformed. And overall, even though some people think of these samadhi practices as something uniquely used to concentrate deeply, which is pretty cool, but very technical, kind of boring. These practices actually are some of the most therapeutic practices in that they very deeply, or they can very deeply transform our mind. And part of that transformation is the arisal of these two types of joy or delight in our minds. In Sanskrit, they're called priti and sukha. In Pali, the first one is called piti. Sukha is the same in Pali and Sanskrit, same word. At least sounds sort of the same. The spelling might be a bit different, but the overall idea is that these are two types of joy that would arise in concentration. When we're using concentration practices, and this is where a lot of us would be familiar with the word shamatha, or calm abiding, or serenity meditation. And this is, of course, how many people come to Dr. Wallace's teachings in the first place. They hear about his very lucid explanations of shamatha practices. He actually teaches the entirety of the path and does that with great lucidity. But many people come to his books because they want to learn this, shamatha, balancing the mind in profound ways. And this is what he tells us about these two types of joy when he talks about shamatha practices. These two types of joy, or these two types of delight, let's put it that way, arise as we're going deeper and deeper in our concentration practice. So for the first one, following the close examination of the object, and that's another thing that would arise in our practice, the next stabilization factor of zest arises. So stabilization factors are these specific mental functions that would accompany our meditation as it gets deeper. So one of these mental states or mental qualities would be zest. It begins by percolating up as interest. You start attending with a greater sense of interest. So I should say that these two terms, zest and joy, are of course sometimes translated in other ways. So priti or piti, sometimes also translated as delight or joy or pleasure, and there are many similar words that could be used. And then sukha is sometimes simply translated as happiness, but it can also be joy, or once again, delight, or well-being, and so forth. But what we need to understand is what it refers to here. And the first one is sometimes described as the experience of finding joy and pleasure in our practice. So we start meditating on our breath, which for many people is a fairly boring thing to do, but we do that daily. We do our mindfulness of breathing, we count our minutes, we start the timer, we open the guided meditation, we'll listen to it, and we do it day in and day out. We do that again and again and again and again, and we accumulate literally hours of practice. And try to do that correctly. That's why we can benefit from guided meditations, not simply trying to start the timer and then fall asleep, and then end the meditation when the bell rings. So we're trying to perfect our practice, and over time, even in a practice as simple as mindfulness of breathing, we would start feeling that we're starting to enjoy the process of attentional training. It starts to feel good. And for some people, and in the Tibetan lineage, it's explained in terms of differences between people's physical constitution or energetic constitution. For some people, this zest would even strongly feel as physical bliss. Actual pleasurable experiences in the body that start coming when people are meditating. And not just a passing experience one time, just actually the body feeling good each time we meditate and the mind starting to feel good. So how it feels for us would be different depending on these individual factors. But we start to enjoy the practice. That's zest. And then eventually, sukha arises. And here Dr. Wallace translates it as joy, but in other books, actually, he uses sometimes a different translation. But what it means, the second stage, is that it's simply a sense of well-being. Out of the heightening progression from interest to zest to ecstasy, there arises joy, simply a sense of well-being. This one actually feels as lightness that starts to pervade our life, not just our formal meditation sessions. The first one arises specifically in meditation. Meditation starts to feel good, interesting, engaging. We kind of want to meditate more because it feels good, not just because we are spiritual warriors who want to transform our mind. There's lightness or the joy coming in meditation. But the second one, joy, is a sense of well-being that makes our body feel somewhat lighter. Essentially, we're getting less depressed, is one way of putting it. We're starting to feel more light. It's easier to move through life. And that, of course, as we continue practicing and as this factor continues growing, becomes more and more stable. And that's a type of joy. But it comes from concentration, from doing the work of concentration, once again, with joy. So that's where the associated practice with this one is gradually training in mental composure through shamatha. So how to gain these two ones? Well, it's not simply a thing of doing an exercise here and there. It's just accumulating literally those minutes, doing that training, doing the, in a way, heavy lifting, except as we know now, it's light lifting, and that the more we do it, the closer we are to priti and sukha, the closer we are to finding joy and pleasure in our practice, and the closer we are to finding lightness of being through our practice, instead of constantly feeling that we're so deeply pressed down that it's hard to even get up, which is not a funny thing, not a thing to make fun of at all, but to imagine, hey, this completely different experience might be available if I gradually move towards it. Wouldn't that be wonderful? So that's the working hypothesis here, of course, tested by multiple contemplatives, but offered to us to experiment with. And then the next type of joy is associated with the third type of education, inner education, and that's education in knowing the nature of reality, which includes such things as the nature of our person. How does our person or personhood exist? The nature of our mind, the nature of all outer phenomena, the nature of our own cognition, perception, and so forth. All these different questions that might be tackled from slightly different points of view by different traditions. And even within Buddhism, there are so many different styles of practicing insights, but they are all about deconstructing a frozen perception of reality and opening up to something that's incredibly vast and spacious. That's one way of summarizing it in very simple terms. And so this joy and lightness arises from either glimpses, which some people experience very early on in their practice. I've heard that many times in talking to people, or deep insight. That's something that comes from a lot of work invested in this life, or from a Buddhist point of view, sometimes in past lives, but primarily in this life. We do the heavy lifting, and then eventually we don't only get a glimpse here and a glimpse there, but we get a profound shift, a liberating shift in our perception. And this is where I will quote Dr. Wallace again, but from another book of his. And this was time he talks about insight from a Christian perspective, actually, not Christian as Christian who was co-teaching with me, but yes, the Christian tradition. As a result of such practice, Christian contemplatives through the ages have reported exceptional states of inner knowledge and genuine well-being, and kind of truth-given joy that arises when the heart is purified and brought to rest in its own innermost depths. So truth-given joy is a quote from St. Augustine that many old students of Dr. Wallace would, of course, recognize. Joy that comes from knowing the truth. Even if we do not know the truth fully, what it would be to know the fullness of reality without any veils and any obscurations, just directly knowing the totality of all there is and the nature of it and so forth. Even if it's not that, gaining glimpses into the transitory nature of our person, the transitory nature of our body and so forth, that's very joyful and liberating, very transformative. And that's why the associated practices, and these are any insight practices that we might do, are the way to approach that, But one example of those would be the 4 applications of mindfulness that Christian gave us an overview of in the beginning of this class. These practices lead to this type of joy. But for that, we would also need to first establish some joy of blamelessness, and hopefully, if that's available to us, to also find some zest and some joy of concentration. So to balance and therapeutically purify our mind, which in this case is done by the practice of shamatha, the simple and unelaborated act of perhaps attending to our breath or to our mind or to a visualized object and so forth. All these different types of shamatha objects that we're so perhaps familiar with, but sometimes so bored with, because yeah, the breath that's moving, it can help my digestion and health if I settle my body down. But what's beyond that? Well, they say, the great contemplatives, that zest and joy and even greater types of joy lie beyond that, eudaimonic joy. And then one more thing that is a subset of the joy of knowing reality, and that's bliss or joy or delight that's we would see described in Buddhist tantric texts, the texts of the Vajrayana tradition, which of course forms such a powerful part of the Tibetan textual lineage and Tibetan practice lineage. To this day, credible masters accomplishing these methods and experiencing these types of joy. And since I'm now talking or speaking from Kathmandu Valley, I can very confidently say that right now in the monasteries and also caves here in the valley, there are many practitioners who work actively with this specific type of experience, cultivating these types of joy through very intense meditation practices that are very delicate and require a lot of preparation. But we would, if we, even in the passing, read books by the Dalai Lama about, for example, the overall structure of Tibetan Buddhism, and he has some brilliant books like that. The World of Tibetan Buddhism, I think, translated by Jeffrey Hopkins, such a brilliant overview of everything there is in this system. We would see this type of bliss being mentioned, and that might pique our curiosity. Well, what's that about? Is that available to me? Can I get some of that? And of course, this is where they would say, yes, but in that we need all the preceding types of joy first. But what does it refer to? It actually represents the bliss of mental freedom, but it is also actual blissful experiences that come from very skillfully working with our subtle nervous system. And this is where the danger lies, because actually going into manual mode of trying to control our nervous system and cultivate specific experiences of that is dangerous business, which can lead to certain mental imbalances if we do not do that skillfully. And this is where we need the guidance and preparation and adequate learning. This is like being a neurosurgeon. You need years and years and years of training. You don't just jump into operating on someone's brain, and you don't just jump into manually working with the subtle nervous system because someone said it might be blissful. But within that, people who are properly trained, and there are these incredible practitioners, for example, in the Tibetan tradition called Togdenmas, great female yoginis, Togdens, great male yogis, and so forth, who are masters of this type of practice. When you are working with that, you are experiencing incredible levels of bliss, way, according to what they say, way beyond any type of sexual experiences that people might have, way beyond that in terms of bliss. But what are they used for? They used to cognize the nature of reality once again, this thing, the happiness of knowing reality. So this bliss of tantric practice in Buddhism is just a subset of the happiness of knowing reality. And this is why another mentor of mine and an old friend of Dr. Wallace, Dr. Alex Berzin here says in a talk that I had privileged to translate for originally when it was given, here it's the bliss of being free from disturbing emotions, their tendencies and habits, and so on. So it's not just about pleasurable experiences in the body or in our mind. The actual nature of this bliss is freedom, being finally free from all the neurotic stuff. Can we imagine that for a moment? Finally free and also incredibly blissful. Just, wow, none of that nonsense in my mind anymore. None of that tunnel vision that makes me so miserable and unhappy and makes me do all these horrible things that harm myself and others. And I'm disgusted with myself and with my life and with everyone else. All of that gone through very advanced yogic practice. So available to us, and some basic versions of that are sometimes taught by very skillful masters, even to relative beginners, but the full-on stuff is usually reserved for people who have done a lot of training first. And that's why after training, a lot under the guidance of qualified teachers, cultivating all the preceding types of joy to a certain degree, starting with harvesting joy. Hey, can you just be content with the sound of rain instead of rushing to your private helicopter and flying to that golf field and experiencing all the incredibly vast pleasures that are available to humans, but in the process destroying the environment and everyone else and so forth? Can you be just content? Starting with that, moving along this progression all the way to this. And finally, two types of joy that might be very familiar to those who have studied the four immeasurables or have ever seen a Tibetan liturgy text where there's a sequence of prayers that usually open up with a prayer or open up with a refuge prayer and then a prayer of the four immeasurables, a formula expressing four types of kindness that are deeply transformative and lie at the root of emotional balance and emotional intelligence. So empathetic joy, or mudita in Sanskrit and in Pali. Sympathetic joy is another translation. There are other versions as well, but usually it's empathetic joy, sympathetic joy. I prefer empathetic joy a little bit more than the other one. What this refers to is actively, intentionally taking delight in the good-natured, pleasurable experiences and the general joy of others. So this little picture from some of my travels, it's a sequence of benches in Istanbul. There's the sea there in the distance, and people are just sitting down to have tea and coffee and enjoy pleasurable conversation and looking out into the sea. It's a beautiful day, it's sunny and so forth. And that's good-natured joy. There's nothing wrong with it. They're not harming anyone. We could say, are they using recyclable cups and so forth? That's all valid. Absolutely valid to be asking those questions, but in this moment, we're trying to not be, we will ask those questions eventually, and we will make the systemic change and transformation and so forth. But here we are simply knowing, hey, we're just enjoying a nice day, and we're attending to that joy with delight, and then saying, how wonderful. And we're just resting with that. And in the Tibetan tradition and in some other forms of teaching this practice, sometimes there's also an aspirational element added. And in that case, we can say something like, may this joy grow. So there's taking delight, and there's also saying, may this joy grow. These two elements. And that's what empathetic joy really is. A powerful practice that is also one of the practices for cultivating very stable concentration. Not very actively used these days for that purpose, but actually described as one of the best ways to do that, because it actually means that we need to immerse our mind in joy and rest there. And once we get the hang of it, what could be more pleasurable than to keep going back into pleasure and resting in it? So it's a self-reinforcing cycle of concentration, very powerful. So we do that, and we can use that for concentration, but we can also use this practice for simply finding more joy in our life. We can use this practice to counteract the opposite states of jealousy and the false facsimile of empathetic joy, which is just the giddy, silly joy, which ignores how complex reality is, and there's still stuff to be fixed, and it's not enough to simply be enjoying cups of tea all the time. You know, just avoiding that giddy, silly version of it, avoiding jealousy and envy, which lies at the opposite of the state, and resting in this very wholesome, beautiful state that notices eventually, when we've expanded this practice outwards to everyone in the world, that notices all the beauty that there is in the world and rests in it. And this practice is also a very good antidote to being a generally pessimistic person, because it starts in its formal descriptions. And once again, some people might recognize that from having practiced it. It quite often starts with thinking of a person who is naturally jovial. The Dalai Lamas of this world, the people who are naturally laughing and enjoying and delightful and so forth, despite the difficulties that they have to attend to. Just a natural sunny disposition. And even in the colors we've shared, so many colors were yellow and golden and all these hues of the sun's light. And that's not for nothing, because we do talk about the sunny disposition. And this is what we start with in this practice in many cases. But then we also need to find the sparks of joy in our own experience and find the sparks of joy in everyone's experience, and then rest in this blissful fiery, blazing ocean of joy. And although I have absolutely no accomplishment of this practice or any other practice, believe me, I have had the incredible joy to do 2 months of retreat on this practice right as the pandemic was starting in 2020, which was in a way ridiculous because people were passing me notes into the retreat talking about the very problematic state of the world. And here I was trying to focus on all these parts of joy that still exists in the world and in my own being. And although that might sound as a bit of a dissonance, I can say that very largely, that very largely prepared me for what was to come once that retreat was over. And it's still something that I carry with me to this day, very transformative, powerful thing, just to be able to notice those things and rest in them. So I very much recommend that. And due to our time being limited, we won't be doing this meditation now, but there is a video recording that you can use, guided by me, recorded by Venerable Tenzin once again, that you can use to experiment with this practice if you have not done it before. And of course, there are many versions of this practice led by people who are much more qualified than me. And then this practice is quite often combined with another type of joy, and that's our final joy for today. That's the joy of rejoicing, anumodana, a different word in Pali, also a very different word in Tibetan. In Tibetan, rejoicing is called jesuirang, whereas empathetic joy is usually simply called galwa, which is a generic word for any type of joy or delight. Jesuirang, anumodana, essentially finding joy in causes of happiness, in that which is virtuous, not the good-natured experiences that are experiencing a nice cup of tea or even experiencing very profound realization, but causes that lie at the root of the eventual good result, attending to virtuous mental states and virtuous actions. And then, quite literally, that's how some of the great yogis of our time teach this practice. Thinking of those things, and then in our mind generating the thought, how wonderful, how amazing. And this is slightly different, but I should say that when Dr. Wallace guides these practices, a lot of the time he combines empathetic joy and rejoicing into one meditation, which becomes even more powerful then. These practices are very strongly related to each other. It's the same root of mod or mood, that these vowels that are interchangeable in many languages, but the emphasis is slightly different. Empathetic joy attends to the resultant happiness, whether it's very trivial or very profound, hedonic or eudaimonic, as long as it's good-natured, as long as it's not schadenfreude or joy at the suffering of others, as long as it's not joy at having tortured many beings and delighting in that. So none of those, but simply the good stuff that's not too questionable in our own understanding of ethics. So that's where empathetic joy directs its attention. But for rejoicing, attending to the causes, the virtuous mental states and virtuous actions. And that sometimes, of course, refers to other beings and their virtuous states and actions. And sometimes that refers to our stuff. And a very powerful, I would say, practice that is also a coaching technique in this case, is to sit down and to think of at least 3 good, meaningful actions that we've done and 3 good, meaningful actions that others have done. Today or in the past, throughout our life, at any point, just doing that a little bit, but really making it a daily habit. One of my teachers, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, actually suggests stopping when we reach the point in, for example, a liturgy practice, and those often include rejoicing, stopping there and doing many, many minutes of rejoicing by going through so many beautiful things that incredible people in this world do, and people like us do, and we did, and others did, and people of the past did, and Buddhists of the future will do all of that, an incredible ocean of rejoicing that might take hours for people who are really dedicated to this practice. It's very transformative. But at least, I would say from my experience, even to try to do find 3 points of rejoicing for ourselves and to find 3 points of rejoicing with regards to the actions of others, that's powerful. And another practical suggestion, and we'll now do a couple of minutes of rejoicing before we conclude. Another suggestion is that so many people who practice in the Buddhist tradition or in the Christian tradition and Muslim tradition as well, and many other traditions, have prayer beads or malas, as we call them in Buddhism, which essentially are beads that you use for spiritual practice. And even if you don't use your beads, and those can really be, for this practice, any beads at all, If you don't use those for reciting mantras and so forth, well, rejoicing is a wonderful practice to do with them. And that means with every bead, we find something to rejoice in, either from our side or from the side of others. And with an actual mala or a rosary that includes many beads, what we can do is we do half on our own actions that are meaningful and virtuous and so forth. And it's not about pride, it's just recognizing the virtue in the quality, not thinking I'm so great. And then half the mala, half the rosary for the actions of others. That might take a while, but so does any training. And then eventually this quality or this talent of rejoicing becomes deeply habitual. So to conclude this session, we can just do, and that's why it's called exercise, not meditation, could just do 1 or 2 minutes of rejoicing by simply calming down, coming back to our body, breathing naturally, relaxing, resting. And then thinking of anything meaningful or virtuous we ourselves might have done in this session. Maybe contemplating the topic of ethics or attending closely to ideas that might be changing my habits, or sharing the space with others and projecting kindness. Thinking of eudaimonic well-being, anything. We find something and then we generate the thought, how wonderful, how amazing. And then we turn to the actions of others. For example, other people who have been present with us in this session or have watched this session if we're using a recording. But those people as well have been using their attention skillfully to do something meaningful. How wonderful is that? And so generating this delight, how wonderful, how amazing, and resting in it, in this sense of wonder and beauty. And then at the heart of it also, rejoicing in the potential that we have, potential for goodness that is with us just because we have our body, we have our speech, we have our mind, we have our basic quality of awareness. And at the very depths of that, the nature of that awareness is our basic goodness, our Buddha nature, our pristine wisdom. How wonderful to exist with all of that. So may all these forms of energy that we as beings possess, may they serve greater joy in this world and bring joy to all beings, bringing less harm and bringing more benefit, more and more and more with each passing day. And with that beautiful wish, we conclude our session, our exercise. And from my side, I just want to mirror what Christian said in the beginning, thinking, expressing my deepest gratitude to Christian for teaching today with me, expressing my deepest gratitude to the Contemplative Consciousness Network, to Venerable Tenzin for recording this session and providing tech support, and of course, to all of you for showing up, sharing our aspirations, and exploring this topic with us. So please find more joy in your life. May your weekend be joyful. May all your days be joyful. And once we conclude, we'll be sending out this recording along with our slides and some additional materials very soon, hopefully, so that our collective joy grows as well. So thank you so much. Deep bows to all of you, and we hope to see all of you again sometime, somewhere. Thank you.